Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to show how I did this graphite drawing of this dog, but I'm going to have lots of tips that primarily focus on how to draw backgrounds with graphite. Now starting off here, I'm using an eye makeup applicator to apply my graphite powder. Now graphite powder for me features in every single one of my graphite drawings. I think it's a wonderful addition for a base layer and it works beautifully for backgrounds. Now I'm using this to just establish where my main lights and darks are, but what this is doing very quickly is enabling me to get that blurry out of focus effect, which is going to take significantly longer if I didn't use graphite powder and started straight with my graphite pencils. For me, the use of graphite powder here is crucial, and I just find that not only is it a fun way of working with graphite, but it gives us that end result fairly quickly. If my background was fairly light for a different portrait, I would be more than happy to just use graphite powder for the entire background. But for this piece, there was a lot more of those darker values that I did want to capture for this. It really helped with the overall depth of the entire drawing. So once I've got this graphite powder layer established, I can then come back in with my graphite pencils and darken those layers where needed. Because the one thing here to remember is when using graphite powder, it's never going to be as dark as what the graphite pencils can create. So this is something where we're aiming for that good level of contrast, a nice variation between those highlights and shadows, but also capturing those crucial midtones. Now the midtones for me are something that I pay just as much attention to because they help with the level of softness. If this background didn't have the midtones here, then everything is going to look fairly flat, even if I've got my highlights and shadows established. So when I work with any drawing, I always want to be focusing on the midtones just to make sure that I've got as much depth in my values as possible. Now as I start working with my graphite pencils, this is where I'm starting to now work on one small area at a time. When I worked with my graphite powder, because it is a fast way of working with the medium, I'm able to work in whole individual layers without feeling like I'm going to rush through or skip parts. Now for me personally, this is a really big factor. I don't like to work in whole individual layers usually because I do find that it's more likely to cause that hesitation just simply where we're focusing on too much of a larger area. But because graphite powder is able to speed up that process, it can work quite well. Now as I'm working with my smaller sections here, I'm making sure to give each individual section the right amount of time. So I'm not trying to just put in a solid darker layer, I'm really paying attention to that reference photo and breaking up where any variations between the lights and the darks are. Now the technique that I'm using here with the pencils is predominantly the side of the lead. This enables me to get a soft effect without having the scribble marks that are associated potentially with using the tip of the pencil. Now the pencil technique, the layering process and so on is something that I really do cover thoroughly in the real-time version of this tutorial. All of my step-by-step lessons are recorded with a voiceover while I'm drawing, so I'm able to explain everything in the moment. If they are of interest, then I'll link the information to that in the description below. Now as I've mentioned, working on these smaller areas, at this stage I was ready to start enhancing more of the highlights. So I used my putty eraser there to lightly dab to create some more of those lighter circles and then adjusted the shaping of that putty eraser to create more of those out of focus grasses. And again, the one thing to bear in mind with backgrounds like this is to not force the detail. That goes with the pencils and the erasers, which is why for the top section of this background, I stayed away from my Tombow mono eraser. Now the Tombow mono eraser is something that I will use throughout the later stages of this background and for the dog, but for the top section here where it is more blurry, I didn't want there to be any more of those finer individual lines that is more likely to happen when using a Tombow mono eraser, which is why I did prefer to use the putty. Now the one thing to consider here is not to go over the top with the erasers. It's very easy to do, especially when working with something like this, because for me personally, I know that adding details is one of my favourite parts about any drawing in any medium. But for this, I needed to always tell myself to not add too much because of course that's then going to make that background look closer to the viewer and more in focus. So being aware of how much detail to add in each section is really, really important. Now from time to time here you'll see that I'm actually tilting my drawing board forward. This is something that I do throughout my drawings when using graphite, just to make sure that any of the overhead lights that I'm using aren't causing too much graphite shine. So by leaning that forward ever so slightly, we get a true representation of just how dark that graphite is without that shine visible. Obviously, once it's framed and on the wall, we won't have these bright overhead lights over the top. Now, however much I try to position my easel lights correctly, there is always going to be a degree of glare. So it is something where leaning forward, tilting that drawing towards you from time to time, just helps to get a true idea of how dark that layer of graphite is. Now, as I'm starting to work on this section, there was a hinting of little branches in the bushes at the back. And again, this is one of those areas where it's very tempting to force lots of straight, harsh lines. But that, of course, is going to hint at that detail that I don't want. Now, when I come back in with my putty, I don't want to be forcing the sharper edges. So although I'm indicating at more of the definition of the highlights, you can still see that there is a degree of softness. Now, this is where the midtones are really important. If I have my putty eraser highlights right harsh up against a darker line, without there being a midtone in between, I'm going to force too much of a harsh edge. So in all of the real-time videos, whether or not it's a background portion like this or fur, I always talk about the importance of the transitions between a light and a dark. Now, of course, this is something that I can mention more specifically in the real-time tutorials, because each area is going to have that variation that we need to capture. There is no rule from one part to the next. So I want to be making sure that that reference photo is not too zoomed in, which I know I've already previously mentioned, but it's something that can make a big difference. When working on smaller areas like this, it's very tempting to zoom straight into that one area, which if I'm working with a lot of detail on the main subject, I will do from time to time. But backgrounds like this, I do find it more beneficial to have that reference photo zoomed out, because for this, we don't want to be forcing in too much detail that we might be more tempted to focus on if we zoom into that image. So I do think for drawing backgrounds, it's something that can make a real difference. So that little white fine eraser, that there is the Tombow mono eraser that I've previously mentioned. I stayed away from the top section of that background. You can see there that it was creating far more of those finer lines. It makes it look more sharper and in focus. So depending on the type of effect that we want, and some backgrounds are going to have detail, those erasers there work really well, but it's just being aware of when to use them to make sure that we're not forcing in that detail. Now, one thing that can really happen with anything, whether or not it's a detailed subject or the blurry backgrounds, is if we start working with our erasers and they're not working, the highlights aren't really showing up, it might be that the layers of graphite underneath aren't dark enough. So what I'm coming back in here with my graphite powder before I start with my pencils is I'm wanting to darken that base and then come back in with my erasers. This is that bit of putty, and then that's able to show up far more easily. If I hadn't have darkened my layer of graphite powder and gone straight in with my erasers, they wouldn't show up because there's not enough graphite to lift. Now, this is something that is really important and makes a massive difference to the overall depth. If that layer of graphite powder wasn't darkened, either with graphite powder or of course the pencils, as I am doing here, then the contrast overall is going to be lacking. The portrait is going to end up far too light overall, and the darker values here really is what helps to create that 3D realistic look that I'm going for. Now on the foreground, this is where more of that detailed texture, it was almost like little pine needles were on the floor, creating a little bit of a crisscross type pattern. Now, the one thing that's important with this is nothing in nature is going to have any real symmetry to it. So I didn't want to just create a load of random crosses for this. I wanted to make sure that I had that variation from start to finish. So one of the things that I do to establish that is I don't work with my erasers or my graphite pencils from left to right. I'll usually work at the top, the bottom, the left, the right, and then I'll mix that up as I go. Although I'm working in smaller sections, I won't just work in that small section from top to bottom or left to right. You can really see that in this corner here, how I'm moving from each little area within that main section. I just find that this is one thing that really is beneficial to make this process here look more natural. I know that if I was to work from left to right, I'm going to end up with details that end up in rows or columns, and this is something that I do want to avoid. It's going to end up making the drawing have too much of that rigidity that I'm looking, to avoid. I want as much of this natural, realistic look as I can. Now, when working with a background like this, it is important to realise that the background doesn't always look as effective until we've got the in-focus detailed portion in. Now, this is why at this stage I decided to start on the dog, because there wasn't anything with the background that I felt I needed to change, and I didn't want to start overworking it. So in those situations where I can't really pinpoint anything and I'm fairly happy, I'll move on to the subject, and then any major changes to the background are usually going to be more easily identified once that animal is drawn in. Now, starting on the fur, again I'm using my graphite powder, but I've switched over to a small paper blending stump. The only real reason I've done this differently for this applicator is because I wanted to be hinting at a little bit more of that fur direction at this base layer stage. Working with an eye makeup applicator, it causes more of a natural softness, which for the background that needs to be out of focus and blurry is perfect. But for this, being that I am going to be adding more detail, I did find that the paper blending stump works better. Now, as I start working with my graphite pencils, I'm again working in more of those individual layers and stages. I don't want to be jumping into my brightest highlights too soon. I want to be making sure that I've got enough of that graphite powder and those darker values established. Now, when working with graphite, it can be quite overwhelming to go quite dark with that layer first of all, because we might have that worry that we're not able to get those highlights in place on top. But as long as the graphite has been applied correctly, those erasers can pretty much lift majority of that graphite, especially if we worked with graphite powder first. Now, this is another reason why I love using graphite powder, because on the right hand side here I haven't really used as many of my graphite pencils because the fur on the right side was lighter. So I can use my graphite powder, establish that darker base, and then if I need to, go straight in with my erasers. If the fur is generally much lighter, you may not need to use the graphite pencils much at all. Now, I do have a little white fur cat study tutorial here on YouTube where I don't use graphite pencils at all. It's all done with the graphite powder and then the erasers on top. So if you would like to see that technique for really bright fur, then I'll link that video in the description below. Now, the key to this kind of drawing, because the overall portrait is not massive, it was only an 8 by 12 inch, it therefore makes the full body of the dog quite small in relation to that. However, I'm still able to achieve a high level of realism because the contrast is right. Now, in all of my videos, this is something that I focus on, and I know I've mentioned many times in this video alone. But the contrast here is what's helping this dog look realistic rather than hundreds or thousands of individual details. Now, of course, working larger, we're able to add more of those details, but for this kind of fur texture, it could actually make the fur look wiry. So because this fur has more of a softness to it, it actually works really well for these smaller portraits. Now, in most cases, if I was to do a full body drawing like this, I would work on maybe a 12 by 16 as my smallest size. But because this background was quite involved and the amount of work to go into that, I didn't want to make this too big because that on its own could be quite overwhelming. So working on these smaller scales like this, it really encourages us to refine that pencil and layering technique so that we can achieve more out of our smaller drawings. Now, the main techniques that I'm using for this fur texture, and this would be the same if I was working larger, is I'm using my graphite powder and my graphite pencils to establish my main darker areas, and then I'm using my erasers here to pull in the highlights on top. This works really well for this overlapping kind of fur texture. So cockapoos would be very similar with the way that that wavy or curly fur overlaps those darker layers underneath. Now, of course, depending on the fur texture that we're drawing, the layering process is going to have to be adjusted potentially. But here, I want to be making sure that I'm simplifying this as much as I can because this fur can be quite overwhelming to work through. The way that that fur overlaps, the way that it curves and changes direction, especially as it gets a little bit longer on the body, this could actually make each of these parts far more confusing and make us think, where do I start? Now, when I get that feeling that I'm not quite sure, I want to break it up into more individual layers. And this is something that I do focus the real-time tutorials on. Being able to simplify that layering process so that we're only looking at one layer at a time can make even the most complex fur textures easier to tackle. Now, when I first started with the graphite powder, one of my biggest tips here is just to focus on the main shapes that you see. Try not to visualize it as fur as such. If you can see it curves down into a specific shape, map that in initially so you know where that is. It makes the entire drawing in that section much easier. Now, I haven't ever added in one solid layer of graphite either. I don't want to work with one solid base and then pull in some of my midtones, then my highlights. If I have a bright highlight here, like on the right side of the body, I haven't added as much graphite. So allowing more of the white of the paper to show through means that I know I've always got that lighter highlight in place from the very beginning. It would be the same with a highlight in the eye. If there was a bright reflection there and it was truly really white, I know that I need to allow the white of the paper to show through. I wouldn't want to add any graphite there and potentially make that even just a little bit darker, because it might have that worry that we're not able to remove all of that graphite if we go a little bit too heavy-handed. So making sure that the white of the paper there is visible is something that just takes that pressure off. Now, this lower part of the dog, this again is another area that could be quite confusing, because the legs, the way that the front paws are off the floor completely, the lighter section that I'm just working on here is actually the back foot. So I don't want to confuse these two sections together, because otherwise that front leg is just going to look too long. I want to be making sure that here I'm breaking it up into each individual section so I know exactly what it is that I'm working on. And again, always working with those same combinations of pencil technique and erasers. It just worked really well for this drawing. The last couple of minutes of any portrait I spend refining my contrast, making things a little bit darker, maybe tidying up here where I've got my background that's not quite up to the edge of the fur. I really don't like that glow effect where it looks like the dog's been drawn at a different time to the background. So this is something that I'll always spend just getting right. It makes a big difference to the end result. So I do hope that this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up. It makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you would like to draw along to the real-time tutorial of this or any of my other step-by-step lessons, then I'll link all of the information to those in the description below. If you do have any art-related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments, because I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video next week. But as always, thank you so much for watching.